What's up, everybody? So today I decided I would react to another What If Alt History video, this time on his second channel, History 102. And basically, this channel, it looks like it's a series of lectures or video lectures he's giving about different historical time periods or different civilizations, very much in the style of a high school history teacher or a college history professor. And then this one, he's his this video is on Mesopotamia. So I figured I'd give it a watch and give my thoughts. Now, as I said in a previous video I did where I reacted to What If Alt History's Islam video, I don't have a problem with him, or I don't have too many issues with him. I think um some of his knowledge or um, arguments about ancient history can be somewhat inaccurate, but I've seen several of his modern history videos, such as a recent one he did on the Weimar Republic, or 1920, which was like 1920s Germany, uh, post World War One, post World War One Germany. Um, but Yeah, I don't, like I said, I really don't have an issue with him, but in this video, he gets several things wrong, so I wanted to react to it. Skip the intro.
So I arrange History 102 chronologically on the YouTube channel, and this will almost certainly be the first episode in that chronology. If there ends up being a video about the invention of agriculture or the last ice age, I'm going to be very surprised. Who knows? Maybe Samo's right and they'll discover a new civilization um, from the last ice age that we end up covering. But hi, everyone. If you're starting the show here, I want to say hello. Thank you for coming. Continue to watch. We have a lot of content.
Yeah.
And for like every history of the world
Yeah, guys, make sure you continue to watch his lectures, as he said.
you read, this is going to be the start of it. And so Mesopotamia is always the first chapter of your history of the world. And
I mean, that is true. Any like world history or history of Western civilization book you read, or any history of Western civilization or world history course you take in high school or college, they always start with there's like a brief lecture on maybe the origin of agriculture, but usually the first section is on Mesopotamia.
I am going to write my
And obviously the reason why is because uh, Mesopotamia, the invention of writing occurred in Mesopotamia, specifically with the Sumerians.
own history of the world in the next few years at some point. And my big barrier to entry is I just have to read 5 books on like the start of civilization, because that's a time period that it's difficult to really, there's like not a lot of books written about it. But I do know enough about Mesopotamia to make this video.
Start of civilization, there's a ton of books on the origins of civilization and the Neolithic transition into civilization, and also the Chalcolithic or Copper Age period. Um, Probably one of my favorite books on the origins of agriculture and specifically Europe is called Europe Between the Oceans by Barry Cunliffe, who's an archaeologist who specializes in European prehistory and the Bronze Age in Europe. But yeah, there's a ton of books you can find on the start of civilization, and there's a ton of scholarly articles and published articles in various journals you can find on that subject as well.
And so we're looking at a 3,000-year time frame. And something that I've said from the Mesopotamian civilization video is that we are closer to Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to the builder of the pyramids. And it's very similar to how we are closer to Tyrannosaurus Rex than Tyrannosaurus Rex was to the Stegosaurus.
True.
History is a very big place. And the irony is that when the pyramids were built in 2700 BC, Mesopotamia was already 500 years old. This is a very, very old civilization. And
I mean, I think they might have been slightly older than that by the time the first pyramid. I'm assuming that's he's referring to the pyramids of Giza. Um, but yeah, by that time the pyramids were built around 2500, between 26 and 2500 BCE. So Mesopotamia, the Uruk period of Sumer first began probably about 1,000 years before that. So, but yeah, as you said, Mesopotamia and specifically Sumer is a very old civilization by that point. It was centuries, if not millennia old by the time Khufu's reign began in Egypt.
Mesopotamia inhabits the area of modern Iraq, which is called Mesopotamia, which is Greek for the land between the rivers, where that whole area of the world is very dry. And Baghdad sits at the latitude of Austin, Texas, actually, which is interesting. But I've been looking up temperatures in the Middle East, and at Medina and Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad is from, it can be it's no, it's even worse further south. In the area around Djibouti, it's 90 degrees in January. So this is a very warm, dry, arid area of the world. And and the only places where civilization can survive in this part of the world is around river systems. And so for everyone who took elementary school history classes, I'm sure you know at the area called the Fertile Crescent, which is stretches from Egypt, the Nile River, out through Syria and Palestine, and then hooks back around to Iraq.
Yeah, this is true. Um, the first civilizations did arise within the Fertile Crescent, specifically Mesopotamia and Egypt. But also there were other early civilizations that arose in different river valleys, such as the Indus Valley civilization and also the Yellow River civilization in China.
And this is where civilization started. And there are fundamentally three cultural designations. You have the Canaanites or Syrians in the middle, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamians. And they're all the founders of modern
Wait, let me go
civilization.
back.
This is where civilization started. And there are fundamentally three cultural designations. You have the Canaanites or Syrians in the middle, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamians. And they're
I mean, pretty much. But also as this map shows, the Elamites were another early civilization, so that's another cultural uh designation within uh the topic of early civilizations. But also, um, well, yes, the only nitpick I have is with the Canaanites. I would restrict the category of Canaanites to the Levantine coast, specifically the coast of Syria and Israel, Palestine, and modern day Lebanon. Um, but there were actually two really early city states within Syria that one were actually very much influenced by Mesopotamian culture. I'm of course talking about the city-state of Ebla and then Mari. And I wouldn't really categorize them as Canaanite because I think one, uh they were more influenced by Mesopotamia, and two, uh they're they're more located inland in the inland of Syria. They're not on the coast. Um, But regardless, they did have I think both Ebla and Mari had, as far as I remember, had the very much similar, if not almost identical deities to the other Near Eastern civilizations that surrounded it.
all the founders of modern civilization. Um, and Mesopotamia is Greek for land between the rivers, where you have the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And they are really unpleasant rivers, where the Nile is a very good river. It flows regularly, it's very fertile. And with the Tigris and the Euphrates, it's just constant flooding, and it's the water patterns aren't normal, and there's no it's very erratic, and it's interesting to compare Mesopotamian versus Egyptian mythology because in Egyptian mythology, and to be fair, we don't really trust Egypt's records because Egypt was a single totalitarian government.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's not that we don't trust Egyptian records. It's just that you have to be careful with the primary sources from ancient Egypt. Like we can learn a ton about um, life in ancient Egypt from various primary sources, but with regards to like different battles or reigns of pharaohs, you just as far as the chronology and reign of the different pharaohs and different dynasties, I would say the Egyptian records and primary sources, specifically with wall reliefs or kings lists or victory, specifically with kings lists, are pretty reliable. But in terms of like military battles, there's obviously going to be a bias, and to make it seem like this, because the whole point of wall reliefs or victory stele is to portray the accomplishments of the pharaoh. So, you don't want to, so obviously there's going to be a bias or exaggeration, uh, basically propaganda to make the pharaoh look victorious and make it look like he has a bunch of accomplishments. But hold on, let me get rid of this. Anyways, uh, as I was saying, but the way, even if there is a bias or you have to take the primary sources, certain primary sources in Egypt with a grain of salt. Any good Egyptologist or archaeologist or historian of the ancient Egypt can, use proper methodology to compare the Egyptian primary sources with other Near Eastern primary sources, like within the Hittite, uh, with specifically with like, let's say Hittite primary sources. And also, I mean, an example that comes to mind is the Battle of Kadesh, where the victory stele and wall reliefs of Ramses II depict him depict him as victorious in this battle. But then also the Hittite primary sources state that the Hittites were victorious in this battle. So, if you're an archaeologist or historian, which is true? And it turns out if you look at the territories of both empires after this battle, the borders didn't really change. And also, if there is a peace treaty, if I remember correctly, and that demonstrates that there wasn't really a clear winner in this battle. Um, so both the Hittite and Egyptian uh, wall reliefs or um, victory stele were exaggerating or using propaganda with regards to the Battle of Kadesh. Um, but like I was saying, any good Egyptologist or historian can compare the Egyptian primary sources with other sources throughout the Near East and figure out the context and see what actually reflects reality versus what um, what is biased or propaganda. And if there is propaganda, what's the motivation?
And I've read a very interesting history of Egypt that said that we need to read about ancient Egypt similarly to how we look at Stalinist Russia. So the Egyptian records aren't fully trustworthy, but from what we know about Egypt, they saw their gods as loving and caring. And
Mm, I would say that's not really accurate. I mean, there was a goddess of love, Hathor, but to see them, the Egyptians didn't view their gods the same way Christians view Jesus and uh, the God of Christianity or the Abrahamic faiths. They obviously were polytheistic and had different deities for different uh, aspects of life or different elements in the natural world, such as, I mean, for example, the god Set or Seth was the god of chaos and disorder. Obviously, that's not a loving or caring god. And, deities such as Thoth, who was the god of wisdom and scribes, um, or, uh, deities like Horus, who is the god of the sky and the representation or the divine representation of or patron deity of the pharaohs. I wouldn't, I don't think there's any evidence that they viewed these gods as loving and caring in the way that Christians view their God.
And for the Mesopotamian gods, their conception of the universe is that the world is the constant battle between order and chaos. And this is immortalized in the Mesopotamian legend of Marduk and Tiamat, where the Babylonian head god was named Marduk. And Marduk was the warrior god who killed the saltwater dragon goddess Tiamat. And Tiamat is symbolic of chaos. And so there
I mean, this battle between a deity and either a sea serpent or a dragon, such as Marduk and such as the battle between Marduk and Tiamat, that can be found in Egyptian mythology as well. I mean, the most obvious example is the nighttime battles between Ra and Apep, the serpent of chaos. So basically every night when, according to Egyptian mythology, when Ra has to uh um under when Ra has to uh complete his nighttime journey and bring and help the sun rise, he has to vanquish or defeat Apep, the serpent of chaos. And also we can find this like myth, this mythical mythical archetype in Ugaritic Canaanite mythology within the Baal cycle when Baal, who's the Canaanite god of war and storms, when he has to when he fights the sea serpent or sea dragon Lotan, which by the way influenced uh the myth in the Old Testament where Yahweh has to battle the Leviathan. So this myth is found throughout the Near East, and the way Whatifalthist contrasts Egyptian mythology and the and Mesopotamian mythology is not necessarily accurate because one, you can find this myth archetype of a deity fighting a sea serpent or dragon or some sort of serpent or dragon in Egypt as well as in Canaanite mythology. So I think, and this myth probably, or of this mythic archetype was probably spread throughout the Near East and into Egypt through cultural contact because we know these civilizations had contact with each other. But also this idea of, I think he says chaos versus order, but let me just go
their
back.
worldview is that we are constantly fighting against chaos, and it's the role of the government to protect us from chaos.
Okay, so again, this is the way he contrasts Mesopotamian mythology and ideology with Egyptian mythology, stating that this view of or this um, dualistic view of chaos versus um, order, and that the government is going to protect the people from chaos. It's not just unique to Mesopotamia, it's also found in Egypt because uh, one, Egyptian beliefs and mythology had this view as well of chaos versus order. And you can see this in the uh, myths about Horus versus Set, which basically symbolizes, uh, chaos versus the versus order. And and this is also symbolized in whenever the pharaoh unites um, the two lands, Lower and Upper Egypt. He's basically bringing order to the land of Egypt. And the pharaoh was seen as the protector, basically the protector of the Egyptian people from chaos and disorder and things like uh things like famine, which bring uh unrest and yeah, basically chaos to the Egyptian land. And this is basically what happens when you with the transition from the old kingdom, the decline of the old kingdom into the first intermediate period, because it there was a famine, and due to the Nile not flooding at its regular levels, there was a crop failure and famine. And the because of this, the Pharaoh was not a since the Pharaoh wasn't able to do anything, he lost in the view of the Egyptian people, he lost legitimacy. So he so basically as a result, his the power became decentralized, and that's when you get the local governors or nomarchs gaining more power in the first intermediate period. But yeah, sorry, I was just rambling there, but the the point is that this view of order versus chaos can be found in both Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythology and their worldview.
And and that's it shows that their society is it's very authoritarian focused, it's very order based.
I mean, you could say the same thing about ancient Egypt as well, because obviously it was a centralized authoritarian state with a rigid hierarchy. And uh, I mean, yeah, uh, um, so it's obviously going to be very. I mean, the fact that it was authoritarian, that's pretty obvious because the pharaoh had some monarch with absolute power who was seen as a god on earth. And there was, and obviously Egyptian government and civilization was very concerned with order within the two lands, or Lower and Upper Egypt, as it's called.
It's very collectivist. And this is a pretty good book, Against the Grain by James C. Scott. James C. Scott is my one of my favorite leftist anarchist authors. And this is a history of the adoption of early agriculture. And one of the fascinating theses of that book is he said that the move from farming to civilization was not consensual, where
Okay, I'm gonna hard disagree with that because, I mean, I guess it's because I have a very Lockean view uh of political systems and government, where obviously people are born with certain natural rights such as liberty and right to life, etc. And like John Locke, I hold the view that regardless if there's a monarchy or a democracy, um, people, the people within a society, uh, give are willing to first off, they in order for there to be a ruler or some sort of state or government, the people are gonna give some sort of consent, because if they didn't, they like let's say with the monarch, they could just remove the monarch or dispose of him through assassination or something. And with democracy, they could just vote him out. But uh, I mean, I hold the the very Lockean belief that uh, individuals have natural rights, and um, a people as a whole, or a group of or a society as a whole, or I guess a collective group of people are usually willing to give up certain, or usually willing to consent to a government or some sort of rule in order for their natural rights to be protected by the government, whether it be a monarchy or a democracy. But and also putting that aside, uh, on an archaeological level, I mean, let me just listen to, I believe he said, I mean, he said it was not consensual, the move from agriculture to civilization, but let's just listen to it again.
Of the adoption of early agriculture. And one of the fascinating theses of that book is he said that the move from farming to civilization was not consensual, where
Okay, so, and on an archaeological level, with regards to what the archaeological record says, I mean, that's also not accurate because we have to, first off, we have to look at what the move from hunter-gatherers to agriculture or hunter-gatherer society to agriculture, what sort of effects that had on humans as a whole. So once humans became, and by the way, I think this thesis by this author he brings up, this reminds me of the uh, one of the theses from uh, the book The Dawn of Everything by, I believe it was David Wengrow and some other anarchist anthropologists, but basically, and it, they one of their arguments, and if I'm strawmanning this, please let me know in the comments. Um, but one of their arguments was that uh, hunter-gatherers and early agricultural uh, societies, there wasn't there wasn't any there are numerous examples of um, different groups moving back and forth between agriculture and um, a pastoral or hunter-gatherer mode of life or um, mode of production, let's say. And the only reason, and it depended on um, what the needs were of these said groups, whether they would move into a sedentary agricultural society or move back into a hunter-gatherer mode. Um, but basically, uh, they are the authors of Dawn of Everything argue like this particular author that What If Alt History brings up. They argue that the only reason that states and civilization form is because um, there was some sort of coercion by a by like higher status elites, or it was basically it wasn't consensual. But I disagree with that because uh both I disagree with that view entirely of the move from agriculture to civilization was not consensual. And I disagree with that because we first have to take a look at what the effects were of um, the invention of farming of agriculture because some of the obvious. So if you look at what happens when humans first started to settle down, and specifically within the Near East, because that's relevant to this video, the the some of some of the effects were um, well, first off, the most important thing is that once people started growing crops and um, began animal husbandry and breeding livestock and all that, all the whole package of an agricultural or farming way of life. One of the things that one of the effects was something called uh, agricultural surplus, where basically an abundance of crops and food and resources. So what that allowed was since there was such an abundance or surplus of food and resources, that led to a higher population or a population growth. And since there were already people farming and you already had farmers who were producing an abundance of food, that's when you start to get specialization of labor or people finding or individuals within these agricultural societies finding um, or becoming skilled at uh, different types of labor or jobs, such as with crafts, such as become they would become things like craftsmen, or they would, you know, they would become skilled at building houses. And this is evidenced by the fact that once you get into the pottery era of the Neolithic, you start to see different pottery types, and obviously that requires a that requires a um, specialized skill set that would only happen once there's a population growth and specialization of labor. And once you have this specialization of labor, you start producing goods and services that other agricultural societies would want. That's when you start to get trade. And then you start trading with other um, societies within the region. Uh, and with also the population growth, you start to get densely populated uh, urban societies, such as Jericho, for example, which is an advanced a Neolithic society with advanced architecture. Like if you look at Neolithic Jericho, there's like a 8 meter tall watchtower or tower that's connected to a wall. Um, but once you start to get trade, so then once you start to get trade and you start to get cities as a result of the population growth and specialization and of labor and different and various peoples within the societies becoming skilled at different jobs, and then which leads to trade with different Neolithic cities and settlements. Then you start to get things such, then there's a requirement for to keep track of the various goods and services that are coming, or various goods that are coming into your city, which eventually leads to the invention of writing. And obviously, being a scribe is another um, specialized skill that leads basically with the, or let me just rephrase, the invention of writing leads to a need for scribes, and scribes are um, a skilled type of labor, which again goes back to the specialization of labor. So once you have, this, certain things start to happen, such as you start to get a more hierarchical society with different classes as a result of this um, this uh, the specialization or development of skilled labor. And then once that happens, um, once you have cities, eventually you're going to get city states because you need, um, obviously the people are going to want protection and a military, um, in order to remain safe and to protect um, their property and also their lives, which goes back to the Lockean view of consent, of societies consenting to a government. So that's eventually, and eventually um, you get rulers or monarchs who rule over these city states. And basically, in a nutshell, that's what happened in with Mesopotamia. That's how the first city states arose, and that's how the first cities arose in pre-dynastic Egypt. Although even within pre-dynastic Egypt, you have different pre-dynastic cities such as Abydos. Um, but eventually, uh, when when the ruler Narmer comes to power, he leads a military campaign into Lower Egypt, conquers it, and eventually unites Lower and Upper Egypt, and that's how you get the start of Egyptian civilization. But uh, regardless, the point is, um, once you agriculture leads to the specialization of labor and different trades or different types of jobs, which leads to eventually leads to producing goods that other societies or cities, states want, and then that leads to writing for the to keep track of the goods and amount paid for goods um and uh and different types of commodities that uh are bought and sold within through trade. And then eventually the military is going to be required because for the protection of the city state and the people within. So then you, and by the way, there's evidence of military conflict and warfare in prehistoric Egypt. There's evidence of battle between peoples living within Egypt and peoples living in northern Sudan or Nubia. And there was a site where like a bunch of bodies were found or human remains were found. And uh there's evidence of like wounds from like weapons and stuff. But yeah, but anyways, once there's a need for a military, you're gonna need a eventually this leads to a need for a military leader, which is what the king is supposed to be, a successful military leader. That's what he's supposed to be in the Near East. And so all of that is to say that uh the move from agriculture to civilization pretty much was consensual, and it wasn't this like sudden event where there was coercion or force used to subjugate the population into a civilization or something like that. It was a gradual process where city states and cities arose, and eventually governments and uh um governments arose, and then obviously um monarchs are eventually placed into power within these city states and or united or nation states like Egypt. But uh and also this the other issue with this argument is that that what if all history is bringing up is the you you obviously you need a definition of civilization, and normally um that if you're going off of I think his name is Gordon Childs or Child Gordon Childs, who's an archaeologist from the 20th century. If you go off his argument or his definition of civilization, normally it includes things such as a government, writing, uh, cities, and normally some sort of uh, and obviously specialization of labor and different types of um, classes of people, such as scribes and a priestly class. But no, it's going to include things like a government and a writing system, and those are things that naturally arise. To sum up, those are things that naturally arise a within the transition from agriculture to civilization. Once you have things like population growth and uh, specialization of labor, and I keep saying that, but it's important in this context. And then you start to have trade, and then yeah, those are things. So basically, civilization is something that naturally civilization and government are something that naturally arise when societies become more advanced and become more hierarchical as a result of population growth and population density. And, you know, once a once a population or agricultural settlement transitions into an urban settlement, there's going to be it always leads to a hierarchy and division of different types of skilled labor, and then a requirement for some sort of leadership or ruler. But all of that is to say that civilization is what naturally arises.
Idea. And most people's conceptions of this time period are formed from what they learned when they were 12. Where for the way the school
I mean, my conceptions of this time period started when I was like 10, to be fair. But um, but most people, actually not most people, but while it is true, most people learn about this time period when they're in like middle school. Um, if you all you got to do is just go to your local library and read like a history of Mesopotamia, and you get a much better view, or read like a history of Mesopotamia or history of the Near East at your local library, and you'll get more, a much more broad and uh more better view of this time period.
systems are formed, you spend a lot of time on ancient civilizations, and then your teachers kind of give up. And
See, in my experience, they didn't spend too much time when I was in middle school. They only spent like a semester on ancient civilizations. And then for the rest of middle and high school, it was focused on American history. And then there was like a semester where like I took a class on world history, but it's all like modern US and world history throughout middle and high school.
and so we view this as this glorious rise of civilization. And the reality is, it was often just oppressive governments forcing people to work, where in most cases, the earliest form of labor in any society is slavery.
Okay, wait, let me go back. This is starting to sound like a Marxian view of economic history and civilization. And I'll explain why he's wrong, why Marx was wrong. But uh, to start, it's not no technically no one's really forced to. It's like I said, these sorts of skilled labor or sorts of specialization of labor naturally arise when there's a population growth and there's a need to um, create an inventory of goods and goods and commodities that come into your city state or your settlement. So you need writing and you need scribes. And then there's obviously a need for a military. That's how you get the warrior class. And then there's going to be a need for there's still going to be a need for farming. And basically uh if you're an economic historian, or most economic historians that I've read, they categorize most of the pre-modern period, including the Neolithic and ancient Near East, as an agrarian society mixed with like markets and stuff. Uh but yeah, it's not like a top-down thing where there's like a all of a sudden there's like an oppressive government that forces you to farm, because when the first city-states in Sumer arose, the 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 peoples were already farming or had been farming for thousands of years at that point. And then it's not like and when you start having an abundance of food, as I said before, you're going to have a need to make pottery so that food and other goods can be transported or stored. So then you get craftsmen, and uh, this is this sort of skilled labor. When a society becomes, as humans are, in my view, naturally hierarchical, um, you're gonna have people that naturally fall into these sorts of um, types of work. So I don't. So yeah, I completely disagree with the view that they were forced to do things like farm or create or force craftsmen to create pottery because they already, by the time of, like I said, that by the time of the Sumerian uh, city states, they had already been creating different Near Eastern or different Neolithic societies within the Near East, and Mesopotamia had already been farming and creating or making pottery and other types of, and even like religious objects like um, statues or figurines of the gods. And that's another type of skilled labor is the artists who would make reliefs of kings and deities, and then also statues of, like, let's say, different types of people like kings or even scribes, because in Sumer, I think, or archaeologists have found statues of like seated scribes. And so all that's to say um, that d people, different types of people who have this sort of human capital or skill set are going to fall in or naturally go into these jobs or types of work. So the idea that, so one, an oppressive government or king is not going to force people to farm, or it's not the case that they force people to farm because they had already been doing that, um, or force them to make pottery or different types of crafts because because farmers and craftsmen had already been making or been doing this type of labor since the pottery Neolithic period. And then also, um, it's not that scribes were forced to write were forced by the government to write or create a writing system for inventory, basically, or to track goods and commodities. It's that was what was needed by the city states and settlements. So eventually people would learn this skill and start start writing or cataloging the inventory. But um, at this point I'm just rambling, but I think the view that an oppressive king or government forced the the Neolithic societies into civilization is overly simplistic.
That's something where Karl Marx was basically right
Wait, let me go back.
in just oppressive governments forcing people to work, where in most cases, the earliest form of labor in any society is slavery. That's something where Karl Marx was basically right, where
Well, okay, there's so many different directions I could go. So Karl Marx's view of economic history and the progression of history and civilizations is completely incorrect because one, it's very he has a very or had a very linear view of economic history and evolution or evolution of civilizations. Um, because so basically, in a nutshell, his view was that the six or the stages of human history were primitive communism, then slavery, then feudalism, and then capitalism. But there's so many issues with this view. For starters, uh, slavery was not an economic system. Slavery is just the action, or slavery is just owning or buying other people as property. It's just owning slave like slavery is just to put it concisely, it's just the action the or the concept of owning other people. And you can use them for labor, but you can use them for things like uh sex, because there were sex slaves throughout history. And you would never make the argument that that an economic system can be called quote unquote sex slavery. Um, but to call and also to call uh the ancient and the classical world, or categorize it as slavery, the economics, or categorize the economic system of the ancient world as slavery is also just overly simplistic and inaccurate because the the way most economic historians and archaeologists would describe the economy of the ancient world would be an agrarian society, subsistence agrarian society with markets mixed in because there was things like trade, and that's how um, scarce resources and goods were distributed through like families who had farms or peoples who had farms or were um, farm had their own land and would farm it. They would the goods and resources were distributed by them farming the land and producing crops from and food the from the crops that they grew and the livestock that they had. So basically, that's why we would call it subsistence and an agrarian subsistence economy mixed with market economies because there were a lot of local markets where different merchants would trade with each other, and there's evidence of trade in um, within Mesopotamia and Egypt. Um, there's evidence of specifically there's evidence of Mesopotamians trading with Egyptians because there's cylinder seals and um, lapis lazuli found within um, Egyptian archaeological sites, which points in the direction of these societies, these two civilizations trading. There's also evidence of various Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations trading with each other. For example, the uh, the Minoans would trade with different Near Eastern or Levantine civilizations, and they would also trade with Egypt because the evidence within the Egyptian archaeological record has shown that, or the evidence found within the archaeological record include various Minoan Minoan pottery and various other artifacts from the Minoans that have been found in the Egyptian archaeological record. But um, and it's also this idea that the ancient world, the economy of the ancient world can be classified as slavery, leaves out the fact that scholars have classified the economies of the um, Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations as palace economies, where basically the um, there would be basically a centralized economy where the palace within Minoan or Mycenaean cities would distribute or redistribute the goods and resources to the the peoples living within those cities. But so basically, to you can't really categorize. Those are some of the reasons you can't categorize the economy of the ancient world as quote unquote slavery, because slavery is the act of purchasing other people and using them uh for work and labor. Like you would never make the argument the that the economy of the ancient world would, you can call it like animal exploitation because people owned animals like oxen and horses to do various labor. And basically that's what slaves were purchased for, um, to do labor for their master, obviously. But that's not how you categorize economies throughout history. You look at how the scarce resources, I should emphasize, are distributed within those civilizations and societies, not what types of laborers or um, what types of livestock or workers are used or how they're used. You look at how goods and services flow within the economies of various time period or within said time periods, and you look at how the and how they're distributed. And basically, in a nutshell, uh, the economies of the ancient world and also the medieval world, by extension, could be categorized as agrarian societies mixed with market economies. And in the case of the Bronze Age, there were several palace economies as well.
Farming formed 10,000 years ago in the area of modern Kurdistan, which historians have called the hilly flanks, Turkey, Iran, Armenia, that area. And
I mean, I think I've heard this before, but I was under the impression that uh, basically farming first arose within that region, but also within what's now Syria, northern Iraq, and the Levant, basically throughout the Fertile Crescent, as it's called.
over time, the agriculture percolated southwards. And again, this book does a great job against the grain. And there was a 5,000 year period because agriculture was invented around 10,000 BC, and the first city started 5,000 BC. And this is something Samo talks a lot about with where he thinks there was an older civilization around the time of the last ice age. I
Uh-oh, that sounds like a Graham Hancock lost civilization of Atlantis type argument. And I don't know if I want to go into the various reasons why um that uh that 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 the argument that there was a lost ice age civilization is that why that's not true. I mean, usually the people like Graham Hancock they'll cite Göbekli Tepe as the evidence that there was an advanced ice age civilization, but for one, the if you look at the earliest strata or archaeological layers of Göbekli Tepe, it started off as like a simple religious site, nothing like super advanced, and then it gets more advanced as you get into the Neolithic layers. And there were other advanced or there were other sophisticated Neolithic sites within the Near East, such as Jericho, which had like as I said, a 7 to 8 meter tall um, watchtower attached to the walls. And um, obviously and I think that was built around 8,000 BC. So that's a pretty sophisticated um, site or example of Neolithic architecture. So I would say Göbekli Tepe fits well within the context of the Neolithic Near East. But regardless, yeah, it sounds like um, Whatifalthist is citing someone who is making that lost Ice Age civilization of Atlantis type argument.
not picking a horse in this race. I have no idea. It could happen, could not. And and so you have cities like Catalhuyuk uh, in Turkey, and Catalhuyuk, we think it was built for a temple site, and so civilization developed. Partly there was a real drought period that really crippled the area, so people started farming as a way to get around the drought period, and also there was a religious like called Catalhuyuk, and we think that people moved into settled places for the religious uh, to build religious monuments. But the truth is, like, we have no clue of this era of history. In 20 years, the narrative about this time period will be completely different than it is today. And this is why I study history and not prehistory. Because in pre
I mean, first off, narratives around history can change depending on what types of historians are um, are basically the leading scholars in whatever uh, in whatever time period or era of history you're talking about. But also, it's not that the narrative of archaeology changes or the narrative of prehistory changes every 20 years. Um, it's that new evidence, like archaeology, like any science, updates because there's new evidence that's discovered, and as a result, the um, hypotheses have to be reconsidered or reworked. So, like, but for example, I don't think like the idea that agriculture originated in the Near East, that's not going to change because the evidence is overwhelming that the first farming settlements were were from the Near East, and obviously there's bioarchaeological or botanical archaeological, I think it's called, evidence that um, the first crops such as wheat and barley were grown and are indigenous to the Near East. So that no narrative is going to change the theory that agriculture originated in the Near East. That's going to be the consensus for a long ass, or that's going to be the consensus for probably the like that consensus is never going to change unless there's like a some new site is discovered and that completely overturns it. But I highly doubt that's going to happen. Um, another, the idea that agriculture first arose around 10,000 BC, like that's not going to change. No narrative, the narrative around that's not going to change because the evidence is quite clear due to radiocarbon dating and relative dating that places the first agricultural sites around that time period.
History, every 15 years, the narrative completely changes. I have zero faith the narrative that we have now is the correct one. But if you're studying the Hundred Years' War or the American Civil War, we can be pretty confident that we know most of the important facts. And so,
Yeah, there's a lot of primary source material for those events. Um, but historians will probably tell you that they know what probably happened within the Hundred Years' War and the Civil War.
agriculture developed in the area around Iraq, and archaeologically, the Middle East was a different place in climate than it is today. Where back then, I think the area of the modern Middle East had a climate that was more like Texas, where southern Iraq, which is now just desert, it's crazy to look at photos. It's just sand dunes everywhere. Um, and
I believe that the the Near East drying, or at least southern Iraq drying out, began once the first Sumerian city-states arose. It is true that, well, I'll let him finish, but I think he's going to say that uh, that region had like a wetter environment during the Neolithic about 10,000 years ago. But hold on, let's see what he says.
and that was a swamp. It was like Florida. It was just southern Iraq was this huge swamp. And it's crazy that if you look at archaeology of this time period, you can find that Chad.
I mean, yeah, so I think that I've only seen one paper that argues that Mesopotamia, or what's now Iraq, was basically like a had a warmer, wetter, or had like a wetter environment, and that the shoreline of the Persian Gulf was further inland. Um, but then again, that started to change probably around 5,000 years ago, give or take, because I mean, one, the people in southern Mesopotamia, specifically Sumer, and then later Babylon, they had to use irrigation technology to fertilize their fields, and in order for them to, uh, um, basically for their crops. But uh, uh, so and also the other thing to keep in mind is I think even today there's still marshes in on the very southern coast of, or close to the southern coast of Iraq. Um, but obviously there was more swamp-like environment as Whatifalthist states during like around 10,000 to like 8,000 years ago, something like that.
Chad in Central Africa was 4 times its current size. It was like mega Chad. Um, and so the Sahara was wet, Arabia was wet. In the
The difference is he talks about the wet Sahara or green Sahara phase. This was about, I want to say 10,000 to 7,000 ish years ago. And that's when the Neolithic period in North Africa didn't start yet during the Green Sahara. There were still hunter-gatherer nomads roaming throughout the uh, Green Sahara. And then when it starts to dry out around, I want to say 6 to 5,000 years ago, that's when the hunter-gatherers in North Africa start to retreat and uh move closer to rivers such as the Nile River in Egypt. And then the, at that time period or during that time period when after the Sahara dries out and people move into and specifically within northeastern Africa, people move into the Nile Valley. That's when um, the first farmers from the Near East start to bring agriculture into the Nile Valley, um, and that's when um, these Levantine Neolithic farmers um, start to also settle in the Nile Valley and mix with the um, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, as is shown by the genetic evidence. This is an example, by the way, of demic diffusion. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to point out that the Neolithic for North Africa and Egypt starts after the Sahara dries out, and then there's a dry, and when the dry period of this region begins.
Bible, they call Israel the land of milk and honey. And Israel legitimately had a much wetter, more fertile climate back then. So the Middle East was pretty different in this time period. And if you look at archaeological finds of of what draw people drew of what the climate of the area was like. The Middle East had a significantly wetter climate. You had elephants, you had lions, you had rhinoceroses, you had oryx, which are these extinct mega cows. So it,
I'm wondering if he's mixing up the Sahara rock art with like archaeological finds in the Near East as he states, because I know I'm not aware of like any rock art or any depictions of elephants from the Neolithic Near East or Neolithic Middle East. I could be wrong, but I know in North Africa and the Sahara, there's rock art dated to the wet Sahara phase or dated to the time period of the wet Sahara. And there's depictions of giraffes and like different animals you would find in modern day, like sub-Saharan or tropical African savannas. Um, and yet these are in the Sahara, so that is more evidence that there was a wet Sahara phase. But I'm wondering if he's mixing that up with um, some idea he has that there was like art from the Near East depicting um, tropical African animals.
it's pretty different. And for both Arabia,
I mean, I could be wrong. There could be art from the Near East that depicts those types of animals, but I'm just not aware of it.
and for Arabia, the Middle East, and Egypt, civilization was founded because the climate got drier. And I'm going to keep referencing this book. This is legitimately one of the best written history books I've read. James C. Scott's the man.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Sounds like James C. Scott gets a lot of things wrong, specifically about how the farming communities uh transition to the first cities and civilization. But I might give it a read at some point.
Um, and he says that people do not willingly submit to civilization. And what that
See, again this idea about like whether people willingly submit or not to civilization. It's not about submitting. It's about things like city states and nation states naturally arising due to population growth and due to um, different classes and special skilled labor arising, such as scribes, craftsmen, um, military people or soldiers in the military, priests, and also monarchs or rulers. Um, that's what, since humans are naturally hierarchical, that's what tends to naturally arise, especially since there's evidence that different Neolithic societies, especially in the later period, had hierarchies, um, as is shown by grave goods that have been found at different Neolithic sites. Um, you know, once that happens, once there's hierarchies in Neolithic societies, eventually you're going to get, um, civilization as we know it, because what defines civilization is as um, V. Gordon Child describes, is it's usually going to have a government, writing system, uh, and some sort, or cities and or urban populations, things like that. So, uh, and also there's going to be, um, I should include that there's going to be example within civilizations, there's going to be advanced architecture and sophisticated architecture. But uh, so yeah, keeping that in mind, the it's not a question of whether they willingly submit or not. It's what naturally occurs. And also there's um for my senior thesis, my senior thesis in college, I wrote a paper on the Bible or the Old Testament in the context of the ancient Near East and how Near Eastern civilizations influenced the Old Testament and the both with historical events that occurred and also the different mythologies that influenced the Old Testament. But there was an article or paper I was reading about um, how King David would have how King David and the Israelites would have um, transitioned from like petty chiefdoms or chiefdoms within um, the highlands of Judea or Judah would have how they would have evolved or transitioned into a kingdom or a like city state. And that's like that's one of the areas or questions that anthropologists are, they write papers on and they argue and discuss and they are trying to figure out is what, how does the transition from a chiefdom or a chiefdom to a kingdom occur? And so if you already so the point of me bringing this up is if there's already a leader or ruler um of like a tribe or of a tribe, then uh the transition to a kingdom is not something uh that people are forced to submit to because they already had a leader or a chief.
means is that for most tribal groups, people just live their lives, they have their clan, they have their tribal culture. And for
And they also have chiefs or rulers over them.
most tribal history, if you don't like your chieftain, you move to a different tribe. If you don't want to work, you don't work. And so these
Mm, that's probably not true because I mean, I haven't read up on any on, or at least not recently. I haven't read up um on tribes, or I haven't read up on any anthropology papers on um hunter-gatherer tribes or and whatnot. But I would imagine if you didn't want to work or you wanted to move to a different tribe, you'd probably be ostracized or punished somehow. Um, I don't think it's as simple as what if alt hist is making it seem like it. This goes back to this idea um, that anarchists and Marxists have, that prehistory and life um, within tribes is peaceful, and it's like um, this idealistic view of tribes, when in reality, um, it's not as simple or it's not as simple or peaceful or as peaceful as they make it out to be. And I'm not saying what if alt his is a Marxist or anything. I'm pretty sure he's right wing or conservative, but yeah, but the view or this argument he's making that you could just move to a different tribe or not work if you don't feel like it. That's most likely not how tribes work.
Tribal peoples have this very like lax, very smooth, very like disorganized culture. And that's really what most people want. But how do you get to a place where you have a government, where you have taxes, where you have cities, is because you end up in a situation where the elites have leverage over the population. And
Again, it's not that elites are have leverage or force you into a city state or government where you have to be taxed. It's what naturally occurs because there's hierarchies within Neolithic societies and Neolithic urban settlements due to specialization of labor and different skilled laborers going into different professions, such as uh, becoming a craftsman or uh, going into architecture. Because as I've stated before, there are Neolithic sites that have advanced architecture, such as Jericho. Um, but yeah, anyways, the once you have that, that's going to require that there's eventually some sort of writing system. And then because once the society becomes advanced, there's going to be a writing system, and then there's going to be some sort of ruler. And in order to pay and fund building projects of the kings and also the military, you're going to have to tax the population. So again, I'm going to bring up my Lockean view of how people interact with their government. I think there is a consent that occurs in a natural progression from uh, Neolithic societies that are pretty advanced. They eventually evolve or transition into city states and sophisticated nation states with governments and taxation.
and so if you look at one of the interesting things is that the spread of agriculture was in almost all cases a story of genocide, where
Mm, not true, because agriculture, if you, again, I'm going to cite um, Europe Between the Oceans by Barry Cunliffe, because that's a really good book on European prehistory. But in that book, he does talk about the spread of agriculture from the Near East into Europe. And basically, if you look at how that occurred, it there's still a debate there's still a debate among archaeologists about whether that occurred via demic diffusion or peoples from the Near East to uh, settling in Europe, or if that occurred via cultural diffusion, where there was contact between prehistoric Europeans and the first farmers from Anatolia specifically. And he makes the argument that it was both. And I mean, if you look at how agriculture spread from Anatolia into Greece and Crete, and then eventually across southern Europe and then into the rest of Europe. It This doesn't occur via genocide. It occurs um, like the peoples from Anatolia, the first farmers settle and mix with the Paleolithic or previous peoples within Europe, and that's shown by the genetic evidence. Uh, then then agriculture spreads into northern Europe, most likely via cultural diffusion because there's a lot less um, early European farmer genetics in northern Europe than there is in southern Europe, as is shown by the percentage of Anatolian farmer DNA in southern versus northern Europe. But uh, but yeah, agriculture spreads into Europe with most likely due to both demic and cultural diffusion. And there was never, and it's not like the Paleolithic peoples of Europe were wiped out by the first farmers. It's that they mixed with that the first farmers from Anatolia mixed with the local population.
Culture developed in the Middle East, it developed in China, a couple other places. And in almost every case, the farmers got a bigger population and then they moved out and genocided the hunter gatherers because the hunter gatherers didn't, it's nigh impossible to get a hunter gatherer population to adopt agriculture because the lifestyle is so different and the values.
That's not necessarily true. There are examples um, of hunter-gatherer societies switching between agriculture uh, and also hunting and gathering or a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. I mean, the first example that comes to mind is the uh, Natufians, who were a Paleolithic culture, but the reason why they're important is because the evidence shows they were experimenting with agriculture and growing crops, but they were I think a semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer culture. But if they're able to experiment with agriculture, then that's most likely what happened with the hunter-gatherers in North Africa, even though that agriculture was brought into North Africa via um, demic diffusion by the first farmers in the Middle East. But uh, but yeah, there are examples of hunter-gatherers experimenting with agriculture. So they can adopt, hunter-gatherers can adopt uh, and learn how to become an agricultural society, learn how to farm.
Are so different, which is a big reason why the whites genocided the hunter-gatherer peoples of the Americas or Australia. And
I mean, Australia, the peoples were hunter-gatherers, but um, the indigenous peoples of the Americas that this, for example, the Spanish encountered were advanced civilizations that were farming civilizations, such as the Aztecs and also the Inca. So it wasn't just hunter-gatherers that the Europeans encountered in the Americas. You had advanced societies, again, for example, like the Aztec and Inca.
and and so what happened in the Middle East is that as the climate got drier and the monsoon pattern shifted further south, is that the Middle East became the desert that it is today. And so people had to cluster around the river systems to survive. And this happened in Egypt too. So this is why Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilization formed at the same time, where you
So they didn't form at the same time. The Sumerians predated Egyptian civilization, as he said earlier in this video, by probably a few centuries.
had to live along the rivers. And Mesopotamia was very strange for a society of this pre-industrial era. Where in pre-industrial societies, it's normal that 90% of the population is rural and 10% is urban. Mesopotamia was strange in that it was a city-state culture. And cities
I mean, that's the same. even though there were rural settlements in ancient Greece, still ancient Greece was prior to Alexander the Great uniting and conquering the Greek world. Ancient Greece was a civilization of city-states, the way Mesopotamia was prior to the Akkadian Empire.
States have existed for the Mayans, the Greeks, various other rural, and 10% is urban. Mesopotamia was strange in that it was a city-state culture. And city-states have existed for the Mayans, the Greeks, various other peoples. Italian Renaissance, city-states tend to be societies that are forming, and a very young society. And then once one city-state gets big enough, it crushes the other city-states. Then you form an empire, then the society goes into decline, etc. And so you saw the formation of these city-states in southern Iraq, in this area that used to be a swampland, but then became desert. And government formed as you mobilized labor to fight for you.
I mean, that's going back to the idea that city-states are the early stages of civilization until one becomes, or one group or city-state becomes powerful enough to conquer the rest and form an empire. I mean, that's pretty much what happened with the Akkadian Empire. It was the Akkadians were a Semitic group that conquered the Sumerians and the rest of Mesopotamia, and also formed an empire that stretched all the way to the Levantine coast. So Mesopotamia, in that sense, isn't really that much different from other ancient civilizations because uh, I mean, that's what happened with Egypt. There were pre-dynastic cities um, that were separate and had conflicts with each other until the Pharaoh Narmer conquered the city-states or cities within Upper and Lower Egypt and to unite them and form the nation state that would become ancient Egypt. But this sort of thing, where the transition from city-state to to empire did happen with Mesopotamia because the Akkadians conquered Mesopotamia, the Sumerian city-states in the south, and also various city-states in the Levant and in Syria. And even after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, um, there were other empires within uh, Mesopotamia, such as the Assyrians and Babylonians.
Sorry, not to fight for you, that too, but to build irrigation ditches. And so what happened is you developed government and cities because you needed to have hundreds of guys to dig these irrigation ditches in order to keep people alive. And like, as a Californian, you must have seen irrigation. It's really big out in the Central Valley. It's just these huge thousands of acres.
Okay, so he does bring up the fact that once southern Mesopotamia starts to dry out around um, around the time of the rise of the Uruk, around the time period of the Uruk era of Sumerian history. Um, Due to this drying out, the Sumerians started to or needed to build irrigation technology in order to fertilize their fields. Um, so yeah, it looks like he did bring that up.
Water, and that could only grow in that climate. And so you saw the whole image we talked about before of their society viewing the government as the protector against chaos. That developed because you needed to have mass mobilization in order to keep the society running, to keep all the irrigation ditches going, to keep the civilization operating. And so the 90% rural urban thing, 90% of the population lived inside the city walls. So the way these societies worked is that you would go out and farm, but you lived inside the city walls. And so southern Iraq was filled with all these city states, like Lagash or Umma or Uruk or Kish. And they existed as these warring states. And that's how civilization formed.
All right. It's goddamn ads.
Hey, sorry, you cut out for maybe.
Oh, yeah. So I said that there were all these warring city states like Lagash, Umma, Kish, Uruk that were self-enclosed, where people would go out and farm the local fields, and they were constantly at war with each other. And people would live in these city states to protect themselves against war with other peoples. Do you have any questions?
Not at the moment, just as
Class, do you have any questions?
trying to keep track, but let's keep going on.
Exactly. And
Yeah, exactly. Got to keep up.
warfare determines a society's government, where if you know the kind of soldiers a society has, you know what its government's going to be. And so in a society where you get a bunch of guys with guns and they fight other people, you're going to have a democracy or a populist dictatorship. In a society where a handful of knights on horseback win battles, you're going to have an aristocracy where nobility manage everything. And so in this era of Mesopotamian warfare, it was blanks. It was not blanks. It was ranks of spearmen, like they're like the ancient Greek hoplites. And so, ironically, I think democracy might be the wrong word, but in Mesopotamian society of this era, you have these councils of elders, and
That is true. There were throughout Mesopotamia, there were councils of elders that um helped out with decision making and were basically a body that advised the king. And these existed throughout the Near East. I believe they existed. Or there's evidence that there was a council of elders in the, or that there were councils of elders in Phoenician city states as well.
so the councils of the elders ran society. And what
That part's not true. Well, it is true that Mesopotamian kings have to would be advised by the Council of Elders, and there was some influence that the Council of Elders had. The person that was running these Mesopotamian societies were the kings, as is evidenced by the kings list that we have of uh for example, the Sumerian kings list and also kings lists that have been found in Assyria. Um, and the king was the one who ran society, and he was obviously the most important because in the Near East, specifically Mesopotamia, the king was seen as basically the intermediary between the national god of the city or yeah, of the city or city state and the population of that city state.
happened was that the priests took over society. Because if you're in a culture like that, where
Is he mixing up the societies or civilizations of South Asia with Mesopotamia in this case? Because the priests weren't, hold on, did he say they were running society?
because if you're in a was that the priests took over society.
Yeah, they didn't take over society. I think he's mixing up like ancient South Asian civilizations with Mesopotamia because I heard Razib Khan in an interview talking about how um, the hierarchy or structure of society within the ancient Indian civilizations uh, after the Indus Valley civilization, they their hierarchy was almost exactly like those of other Indo-European civilizations, like the ancient Greeks, except that the warrior class and the priest class were switched. So in ancient South Asian societies, the priest class was the ruling class rather than the warrior class. So the And those would be called, like in the caste system, those are called, the priest class is called Brahmins, I believe. But I think the priest class did not rule over uh Mesopotamian civilizations. It was the king, again, as evidenced by, or as demonstrated by, the various kings lists that have been found by archaeologists in the land that was Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerian kings list and Assyrian kings list, because we know the names of these kings. And kingship in Sumer most likely extended or goes back all the way to around 3500 BC, or like the beginnings of Sumerian civilization, because we have examples of legendary kings who ruled for like tens of thousands of years. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, or that's mythical, but or that part is legendary. But um the Sumerian kings list indicates that there were the first two kings of Sumerian civilization were, I believe, Alulim and Alagar. It could be if I mispronounced that, my apologies. But these first two kings were Alulim and Alagar, and um, and even though these are probably legendary kings, the fact that these um that the Sumerian kings list these list them as the first two kings at the beginning of Sumerian history indicates that kingship in Sumer, in the Sumerian city-states, was as old as Sumerian civilization itself, if not older than writing, if not older than writing itself. Like there could have most likely there were kings prior to the invention of writing in Sumer, but um, yeah, it was the kings, not the priests, who were ruling over Sumer and Mesopotamia in general.
Because if you're in a culture like that where uh, everyone has to survive against the elements, what happens is that you are terrified that if you don't get rain, everyone's going to die. And so in ancient farming societies,
That's why fertility and storm gods are important. So peoples in those societies would pray to those gods.
it was run by the priest class. And so in ancient farming societies, it was run by the priest class. And the priest did all of these rituals to assuage people's anxiety.
Wait,
So you
is he making the argument that Neolithic societies were run, or Mesopotamia? Let me.
sacrifice people, have these councils of elders. You have society of this era. You have, cursing might be the wrong word, but in Mesopotamian society of this era, you have these councils of elders. And so the councils of the elders ran society. And what happened was that the priests took over society because
Okay, yeah. So
farming societies.
I don't know if he's like mixing things up or just contradicting himself, but he did make the argument uh, that priests were running Mesopotamian societies, which, as I argued, or as I've explained why that's not true, uh, it was the kings that were running Mesopotamian society, as in any other pre-modern monarchy, or as in every other pre-modern monarchy um, society or government.
It was run by the priest class. And the priests did all of these rituals to assuage. That's why all of these ancient irrigation societies were theocracies. And the councils of the elders were managed by the priests. And it's really hard to overestimate how important religion was for Mesopotamia.
I'm wondering if he's citing. See, this is one of the issues with what if alt history is that I think he only reads books from like the history books from like the 19th and 20th or he only reads books about these civilizations that were written in the 19th and early 20th century, when obviously the field of ancient history and archaeology has advanced and has been updated since then. Um, but yeah, it sounds like maybe he's getting this from like a 19th century book on ancient Mesopotamia, but I could be wrong.
where they are legitimately a theocracy, where was for Mesopotamians, where they are legitimately a theocracy, where the Middle East for its entire history has been a theocracy. And the priests owned like between a third to half of the land, and the priests, every single part of your life was in some way religious. And there are some like hyper reactionary rightist thinkers who say this is the ultimate like aim of society. That Avola writes about how it's a perfect society when everyone constantly has spiritual connection to the world. And I think there is a valid.
While it is true in going back to the how the priests, his argument that the priests owned a bunch of land, while it is true that a lot of the priestly class in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, like the priests would own land. Uh, there are also examples of other nobles who owned land. Like in Sumer and in Mesopotamia in general, there was private property owned by nobles or elites who inherited their land from their ancestors. Uh, but that's just something I wanted to point out.
Case there. But also, I don't like when I lived in Peru, the locals have all of these weird superstitions that past a certain point you just think are stupid. Um,
All right,
and
I'm gonna skip this
it
part.
fits very well for the later Mesopotamian priest classes, which is they think they got so good at they think their rituals are so good that they tamed the gods and lucky charms. And the way that works is that their their concept of religion is not our concept of religion. And I'm going to bring up the Peruvians again because Peru, when it was conquered by the Spanish, was at a similar civilizational level as to what Iraq was in this time period, where in Peru everyone's Catholic, but they're not Catholic in a way that makes sense to. You go to church, you pray, you try to be more like God. For if you're in Peru, or if you're in Peru when you're not like in a major city, you're not of a certain social class. Religion means you go to mass, and then the sins and your sins, or you perform certain rituals to clean yourself of sins. And societies on a certain level of development see the world all through magic, and they don't have a concept of rationality. They don't have a concept of they don't have a concept of
I think
rationality.
he's still talking about
You'd have
Peru.
a statue of the god, and each city would have their own god. Everything is mystically connected to everything else through magic. And so in Mesopotamian culture, you would have these idols. You'd have a statue of the god, and each city would have their own god. And so you would venerate the idol of your city. And so you would give your cities.
This is true. Each city-state in Mesopotamia and throughout the Near East had a national god or deity um, that they would worship above other gods. Um, for example, the Assyrian city of Ashur would worship the Assyrian deity Ashur.
Idol, you would give them food, you would give them sex, strangely enough. In Mesopotamian civilization, sex was, they didn't have any taboos about it. So temples would literally have prostitutes.
That's actually true. There were temple prostitutes in Mesopotamian civilizations such as Babylon.
Um, they would give the gods veneration, rituals. I think they had human sacrifices early on, which they phased out. And
Uh, I'm not aware of Mesopotamian societies having human sacrifice. I think he's thinking of the Phoenicians who did have human sacrifice and would sacrifice children, actually. Um, they would have these things called tofits where that were used to sacrifice children. But again, That's the that's the you think that's the Phoenicians that did that. I'm not aware of uh any human sacrifice in Mesopotamia, but I could be wrong.
What would happen is that if your city was doing well, your god would rise. And so what would happen is that as Babylon became the dominant city state, the Babylonian god Marduk rose to be the dominant god in Mesopotamia. And the other gods of the lesser cities fell because if Babylon conquered the other city states, their god by definition was superior to the other gods. It's a mental system to be the dominant god in Mesopotamia. The Babylonian god Marduk rose to be the dominant god in Mesopotamia. And the other gods of the lesser cities fell because if Babylon conquered the other city states, their god by definition was superior to the other god.
I mean, this is this is pretty much true throughout the Near East. If your city state or if your if your civilization, or for this example, if your city or city state conquers other city states, um, then your god of war or your national god was seen as superior and seen as uh was viewed as being favorable towards your city state. Because if you win a war or battle against other city states, then your national god must be looking on upon your city state favorably. And this is true and also in various Iron Age Canaanite descended uh, cultures as well. One example that comes to mind is the Moabites with the um, and their inscription, or the inscription, the Mesha Stele, because in that in that victory stele, the Moabite god Chemosh is described as leading the Moabites to victory over the Israelites specifically. And since um since they were able to win against the Israelites in battle, the Moabite god Chemosh seen as was was seen as leading them to victory and seen as more powerful than the Israelite God Yahweh. Um, but um, but as for the Babylonians and Marduk, even even though the Marduk was the supreme or head god of Babylon during the Neo-Babylonian period, I believe, and this is just sort of a nitpick or a little caveat, I believe during the reign of Napolus, I'm gonna mispronounce this name, but King Napoleonsar, um, the there was an issue with the cult of Marduk, or the temples of Marduk being put out of use. And that's why when the Persians and King Cyrus conquered Babylon, Cyrus promised to restore the cult, or restore the religion or worship of Marduk, because under Nabopolassar, uh, the worship of Marduk uh, was not being basically fell out of favor with the king.
It's a mental system that makes sense if you think about it, but it's so alien to our mental system that it's hard to get moderns to think about it. And so the Bible in the Old Testament was written as a reaction to the fall of Mesopotamian civilization.
Okay, that part's not true at all. The Old Testament is, first off, is a collection of various myths and legends and poems and hymns that were written or composed pretty over like a few centuries. So basically, most of the Old Testament was written between the 8th to 6th century BC, and a lot of it was written during the reign of King Josiah and then during the Babylonian exile and after. But it wasn't a reaction to the fall of Babylon. Although all actually, on the flip side, it was actually or this is more of it's not basically to rephrase this, it wasn't the Bible wasn't written as a reaction to the fall of Babylon. It was, in fact, um it was Mesopotamian mythology and religion that very much influenced the uh various myths and stories throughout the Old Testament, such as the Noah's flood, which was influenced by the Sumerian and Babylonian flood myths. And then also the Moses birth story that was influenced by the birth story of Sargon of Akkad. And then um, with the Tower of Babel story, that was most likely, and I made a video on this, specifically the Tower of Babel, but that was influenced by the when the Hebrews saw the during the Babylonian exile, they saw or they would see the ziggurat of Etemenanki. Um, so most likely the tower that was being built in the Tower of Babel story was influenced that by that specific ziggurat. Um, but the but yeah, no, the Bible, it's not specifically, it wasn't a reaction to the fall of Babylon. It was influenced and it was influenced by various Near Eastern myths and civilizations, and it was composed over um, a number of centuries, starting roughly in the ninth to 8th century BC, all the way into the Hellenistic period, or the 3rd to 2nd century BC.
The Jews, as a reaction to the fall of Mesopotamian civilization.
Again, yeah, not a reaction to the fall of Mesopotamia. It was influenced by Mesopotamian religion, but again, it was composed over a number of centuries and prior to, during, and after uh, Babylonian or the Neo-Babylonian Empire.
The Jews were kind of like the Mormons, where the Mormons left American society and they moved out to the desert to avoid America. And the Jews were like that, where, funnily enough, we've proven the existence of Abraham.
No, we haven't. Archaeologists or biblical or Levantine archaeologists and biblical scholars all agree that Abraham and the patriarchs never existed. They're legendary or mythical figures. Um, and they're probably the best argument for that is because the book of Genesis was composed centuries, if not millennia, after the alleged time period when Abraham lived. And it's quite obvious that, as Israel Finkelstein has pointed out, that the book of Genesis has virtually zero recollection or memory of the Bronze Age, and it doesn't accurately describe the Canaan and the Near East during the Bronze Age. So, and we know that the book of Genesis and the texts within the book of Genesis were written uh, much later, like a millennia or centuries, if not a millennia or two later after the when Abraham supposedly lived, because there are numerous anachronisms in the um in the book of Genesis that indicate it was written after the 9th century BC, which is in the Iron Age, well after Abraham supposedly lived. In fact, one of the examples of these anachronisms that's relevant to Abraham is when he's called Abraham, Ur of the Chaldee, or in reference to Abraham, the name Ur of the Chaldeans is brought up. And the Chaldeans weren't an ethnic, the Chaldeans who ruled over Babylon, they weren't a distinct ethnic group until after the 9th century BC. So there's no way that at least that portion of Genesis, and quite honestly, Genesis in general, was, there's no way it could have been written prior to that, because the Chaldeans didn't exist prior to the 9th century. Um, So that anachronism points in the direction or is evidence that the book of Genesis was written after around the 9th century BC. Um, but and in addition, even in the Iron Age, Ur was still an important site of a former long lost civilization. So that's not an issue. Um, but so the point being, if Genesis was written centuries, if not a millennia after, and it preserves no memory of the Bronze Age, then the most rational argument or explanation or conclusion is that Abraham and the patriarchs never existed. They're just legendary figures that help explain the origin of the Israelites as a nation and as a people, because that was very important, especially during the Babylonian exile, for them to for the Israelites to form a national, the Israelites or the Hebrews. It was important for them to um, form sort of a nationalistic identity, and they needed legends such as the legends of the patriarchs to explain that.
Looked at all of Abraham's genetics, and there was a guy at that time who
We don't have Abraham's genetics. I'm wondering, I mean, I haven't looked, it's been a while since I've looked at the uh genetic tests of the modern day Jews, but I believe they're here. Let me just go back and play this again and see what he says.
Abraham. We looked at all of Abraham's genetics, and there was a guy at that time who's the Y chromosome for all the people descending who claim descent from Abraham. And so Abraham.
Okay, so the Y chromosome. Yeah, we don't have Abraham's genetics because Abraham didn't exist. He's a mythical figure. Um, so yeah, if Abraham never existed, we're obviously not going to have specifically his genetics. I think what if Alt-Hist is thinking of is he probably looked at several genetic studies of modern day Jews and also the genetic studies of Bronze Age Canaanites. And I believe especially Jews, modern day Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews, their Y chromosome, they share the same Y chromosome as other Semitic groups and other Middle Eastern groups. I believe, like again, I would have to go back and look at the various genetic studies or DNA studies done on the Jews, but I believe their Y chromosome is something like haplogroup, or their Y haplogroup is something like J, or I believe it has to be J because that's a Eurasian haplogroup that originated in the Middle East. But um now he also, what if Alt-Hist might also be thinking of the Cohen haplogroup that uh a very specific subset of Jews all share. And I'm trying to remember if it was I think it's a Y chromosome haplogroup they all share. And supposedly it this is like genetic evidence of the Levites or the priests within Hebrew or Israelite society. Um, but again, that has nothing to do with Abraham, and I'm not sure if the Cohen haplotype even points in the direction of of them being descended, or this specific set of Jew or subset of Jews being descended from the Levites, because I believe there are other groups within the Middle East that have this same haplogroup as well.
Abraham fled Uruk, descending who claimed descent from Abraham. And so Abraham fled Uruk, the Mesopotamian city, to form the Jews. And so
First off, I think this is just semantic, but I think it's anachronistic to use Jews to describe the Hebrews and Israelites, because I mean it's true that the Jews are descended from the Israelites, but it's more accurate to call the peoples living in Israel or in that region prior to the Babylonian exile, it's more accurate to call them the Israelites or the Hebrews. I think the term or the word Jew used to describe these peoples wasn't used until the Persian period. Um, but anyways, and Abraham didn't flee from Uruk. He's supposed to be from Ur, specifically Ur, the city-state, which is why the term or the phrase Ur of the Chaldeans is used in reference to Abraham. So, um, yeah, he's not from Uruk, he's from Ur.
So a lot of stuff in the Bible comes from Mesopotamian culture. The Mesopotamians have a Garden of Eden story, they have a flood story, they have like if you read the Bible, you
Oh, wait, so he admits that a lot of the Old Testament, the myths within the Old Testament are influenced by Mesopotamian uh religion, such as their such as the Garden of Eden and flood story. So he should he should come to the conclusion then that Abraham is also a mythical figure and he didn't exist, or he did not exist. Um, but I mean, because he knows that Mesopotamian mythology very much influenced um and influenced Israelite mythology and the myths in the Bible, and that the Bible borrows a lot from Mesopotamian myths. Um, but and it's not just Mesopotamia. There's the stories within the Bible were also influenced by the Ugaritic myths. For example, since we're talking about Abraham, his his there was a narrative or story with Abraham in Genesis that was clearly influenced um by the Ugaritic epic of Aquat. I believe that's how you pronounce it. But uh yeah, there specifically the story where Abraham is trying to conceive with Sarah, but he's unable to do so, and he pleads with Yahweh or the Israelite God to help Sarah conceive of a child so that he can create a nation, which would eventually become the Israelites. But this idea or this this aspect of the story or the story of Abraham was most likely, or I'm very confident it was borrowed from the Epic of Aquat, where there was a king who, I believe it was a king who was who pled with, I believe it was, it was one of the Canaanite gods he pled with to help him conceive of, uh, to help his wife conceive and get pregnant. Um, but yeah, I mean, if this story of Abraham was influenced by this particular Ugaritic myth of the Epic of Aquat, then that should be another indicator that Abraham was not a real person. And I mean, what if all his is he's willing to uh acknowledge the Mesopotamian influence, but I'm wondering why he doesn't realize that Abraham never existed.
see a lot of parallels to Mesopotamian civilization. And the Jews were a conscious, towards the end, Mesopotamian civilization became so degenerate and stupid that like you
What does he mean by that? How did how did Mesopotamian or specifically Assyrian and Babylonian civilization change so much that it became degenerate? Like I can't think of a reason why.
saw all of these people who were actively trying to escape it, and that's what how the Jews were formed.
No, that's not how the Jews were formed. The Israelites were indigenous to Canaan, and they were descended from the Canaanites or Western Semitic peoples, and they didn't come from any outside region. They didn't come from outside of Canaan. They were from Canaan, and they were descended of from previous highland Canaanite peoples. And that's demonstrated by the material culture and their language.
Um, and and so run by a priest class over time becomes less creative.
No, again, Mesopotamia was ruled by kings like every other ancient monarchy.
And Mesopotamian civilization, it was creative in the beginning, and then over time it lost the ability to be creative. And one of the ways this time period is written, it again, the
How did it become less creative as time went on? I mean, so obviously we credit the Sumerians with inventing writing and sophisticated architecture uh and the first cities. But I mean, even in the later Mesopotamian period, like during the Neo-Assyrian period, under the reign of Sennacherib, it appears that there was a there was a device very much similar to the Archimedes screw um, that transported water into Sennacherib's gardens within his one of his gardens. But so basically the Assyrians and the Babylonians, even during the Neo-Assyrian and Babylonian periods, were still innovating. They were still uh, the engineers and architects, specifically the engineers and mathematicians, were still inventing things, such as this water screw that transported water and into the Sennacherib's gardens. Uh, and also that means that the Assyrians beat the Greeks to uh, the invention of quote unquote the Archimedes screw. So they were so yeah, the Assyrians were the ones that invented that specific water transport device. But so again, they were still creative and still inventing and innovating.
entire understanding of this time period is at like a 12-year-old's level, because most people's comprehension of ancient civilizations come from what they read in middle school. And so they act like the Mesopotamians were this advanced, beautiful civilization. And they were the most advanced people in the world, don't get me wrong, but they stopped making any new discoveries past a certain point. And that's the problem.
Again, I point to the water screw that was invented most likely during the reign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib.
Your society is uh, a collectivist autocratic theocracy. Um, and
And I don't know if I would describe Mesopotamia as collectivist necessarily.
and so we've covered the development of Mesopotamian society in general. And then over time, you saw the warfare between the different Iraqi city states. And I said before, we have places like Lagash or Kish or Umma or Uruk, and none of these places are particularly important. You don't have to remember them. I'm sure they were incredibly important to the people of the time, but none of them really bear much importance on your life. And you should know them only because they are the first places that we ever have records of. So the first war that we have on record is the war between Lagash and Umma. And I think Lagash beat Umma, but I don't remember.
Okay, so I've probably been going for about uh probably like over an hour, so I'm gonna wrap this up pretty soon.
And so this is Sumeria. And Sumeria is the first civilization of that part of the world. It's in southern Iraq. In the Sumerians, they have a language completely unrelated to anything else we know of.
That is true. The Sumerian language is a language isolate. It's not related to any of the Semitic languages, and it's not related to any Indo-European languages. But I think most likely because there's one other language isolate in the Near East, and I believe it's Hurrian, the language of the Mitanni Empire. So I agree with Razib Khan on this. There was probably a let's say a proto Near Eastern language that was ancestral to all the languages um throughout the Near East, and then Sumerian branched off earliest, and then that's why it became a language isolate.
And the Sumerians built these giant pyramids. Pyramids, all societies of this era built pyramids.
He's talking about ziggurats. I mean, they're similar to pyramids, especially the step pyramids in Egypt, like the step pyramid of Zoser. Um, but yeah, they're called ziggurats. I wouldn't call them necessarily pyramids, even though they look kind of similar.
Pyramids. The Egyptians were just better at it. The Central Americans built pyramids. The Egyptians.
Although the Egyptians, they most likely borrowed the idea of building a four-sided structure from a giant four-sided structure from the Mesopotamians, because we know that Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerians, influenced the Egyptian civil. To rephrase, we know that Sumerian civilization influenced Egyptian civilization in various aspects of architecture, such as temples having recessed niches, and also uh, in the realm of using mud brick, and also cylinder seals were brought to Egypt. So it's not and even the idea of writing was probably introduced to the Egyptians by the Sumerians, by Sumerian traders. So it wouldn't be a stretch to say that the Sumerians also introduced or brought the idea of building pyramid-like structures to Egypt.
Built pyramids. The Iraqis built pyramids. The Chinese built pyramids. And
again, I'm just going to be nitpicky, but why is he using Iraqis? That's like a modern term to describe the people of Iraq. You should be if you're talking about the ancient peoples from Mesopotamia, you would describe them as Mesopotamians, Mesopotamians broadly, or specifically Sumerians or Akkadians or Babylonians, etc. But that's just me being OCD about the semantics.
so there's a theory that they built pyramids because they were from Armenia originally, and they wanted to like rebuild the mountains of their home country.
Wait.
And so there's a theory that they built pyramids. And so there's a theory that they built pyramids because they were from Armenia originally, and they wanted to like rebuild the mountains of their home country.
The Mesopotamians most likely were not descended from Armenians. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, they were all Semitic, and with the Babylonians, specifically the different peoples that ruled them were the Amorites, the Kassites, and Chaldeans, who were all Semitic peoples. And the Sumerians were most likely just a local population from what's now southern Iraq or southern Mesopotamia. But maybe what he's thinking of is recent DNA tests on modern Assyrians and how they're somewhat or pretty closely related to I mean, I could be wrong on this, but they tend to cluster with Armenians and then other non-Arab Middle Eastern groups. But Mesopotamians were not descended from the Armenians. They were either local southern Mesopotamian populations or Semitic peoples.
But that could be totally wrong. We don't know.
Most likely it is totally wrong, as I've stated, or as I've explained why.
And so the Sumerians developed this society, and then over time, the Sumerians went through their life course. But in the process of that, they developed sailing, or they developed the sail, they developed a lot of modern agriculture. They developed the first cities. They developed writing. The Sumerians, for those people developed writing, they had a system called cuneiform. And so with the Sumerians is the rise of the first civilization. And civilization is from the Greek, the Latin word cives, meaning cities. And so a civilization is a society that lives in cities. And
Uh, as I've mentioned or cited before, according to Gordon Child's definition, uh, civilizations normally encompass or include, in order for something to or a society to qualify as a civilization, it has to have a writing system, a government, cities, or urban populations, among other things. But yeah,
if you live in cities, there's a bunch of other cultural technologies attached to it, like the ability, like normally, every single urban society normally has a government, a writing system, a financial market, and all that stuff. And I give the Mesopotamians a supreme amount of credit for doing that, where they are the first advanced society in the world. And for example, the writing was invented because you needed to keep government records where you had to keep track of these people paid taxes to us, these people gave us blank, and you do see a pretty Mesopotamia was the first society in the world with a market. And so it's funny to look at Mesopotamia and you see all of these very modern institutions. You have rent, you have a stock market, you have like interest paying loans.
the Sumerians, they did have what we would consider banks and loans, but stock market, mm, I've never heard or seen any evidence of the Sumerians having what we know of as a stock market.
And you have money. And it's funny that all of these old institutions that we see as hyper modern things, you could put back 4,000 years ago. And the Mesopotamians also developed a law code because
Wait, hold on.
that we see, you have money. And it's funny that all of these,
They didn't have a monetary system as we know it. That wasn't developed until the at least the that wasn't developed until the Phoenicians came on the scene, I believe, or the Carthage, specifically the Western Punic settlements. I believe the Phoenicians or the Carthaginians had a unit of currency called the shekels or shekel. Um, what the Sumerians and the rest of the Mesopotamian civilizations had in terms of uh they would have what they had rather than a monetary system was a barter system. Um, so they would in the marketplace they would barter various goods, and they also had um weighted silver, which could be used or had the same function as currency, but yeah, it was mostly a barter system, and they use weighted silver, but nothing like a modern monetary system that we know of.
old institutions that we see as hyper modern things, you could put back 4,000 years ago. And the Mesopotamians also developed a law code because you have to use written laws if you want to manage people on beyond an interpersonal level. And so if you're in a tribal society where everyone knows each other, you have these implicit social rules that control how you operate. But if you're in a city and you're dealing with all these different tribal peoples, you have to have written down rules to arbitrate legal disputes. And so the Code of Hammurabi is a famous example of that. And the Code of Hammurabi has become famous because it's a system in which, or it's the first legal.
Funny enough, the Code of Hammurabi, or the copy of the Code of Hammurabi that archaeologists discovered, wasn't found in southern Mesopotamia. It was actually found, I believe, in the Elamite city-state of Susa, this was after the Elamites invaded Babylon.
Code that we know of, and the Code of Hammurabi is famous for an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and that's very much the Mesopotamian value system. Where if
That's also found in the Old Testament as well. Another example of how Mesopotamian religion and society influences the Israelites and their religion and the Old Testament.
For example, if your son murders someone else's son, they have the right to murder your son. And you can say that you can see that the Mesopotamians were developing an elementary philosophy of human relationships. And the Bible tried to move past that because
Not in the Old Testament, because I believe it's in Leviticus, the that's where you see the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth rule or law.
as Christ said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth makes the world blind. And so as Sumeria gradually grew weaker, Akkad rose. And so if you want to look at the map of Mesopotamia, Sumeria is in the south around modern Kuwait. North of that, around modern Baghdad, it's Akkad. And a lot of you would know about Akkad from the right-wing celebrity Sargon of Akkad. And he named him after Sargon. And Sargon launched the first empire in history. And Sargon's empire went the distance from the Mediterranean or modern Syria until.
See, if you look here, the Akkadian Empire stretches all the way to the Levantine coast and includes the Syrian city-state of Ebla, which I mentioned before. In fact, I believe, yeah, it was the Akkadian conquest of Ebla led to the decline of that city-state.
The Gulf. And that was the first empire in world history. And Sargon was able to mobilize the Akkadians, who were a fringe barbarian people, and they conquered Sumeria. And Acadia, for about 2 generations, was the great empire that unified all of Mesopotamia. And with that came the decline of the Sumerian Empire. And Akkadian became like the Latin of that era, where once Sargon of Akkad established the first empire, you saw that region never went back to city-states, where it moved from the city-state level to the imperial level. And so
I will say, after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, there was I believe this is after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, there was a third dynasty of Ur, which was like sort of the revival or renaissance of Sumerian civilization. But after the collapse of the third dynasty of Ur, then yeah, from that point on, it's just different empires ruling over Mesopotamia.
that resulted in a change of the culture. And beforehand, it was run by the priest class. And for the entire period, Mesopotamia was priest class.
Wait, hold on.
Beforehand, it was run by the priest class. And for the entire period, Mesopotamia was priest class. And
Again, no, it wasn't. Prior to the Akkadian Empire conquering Sumer, there were kings that ruled over the Sumerian city-states, including Gilgamesh from the famous Epic of Gilgamesh. It turns out he was most likely a real person, and he was a king that ruled over one of the Sumerian city-states. But yeah, the evidence, as is demonstrated by both the Sumerian kings list and also, I believe there are inscriptions from early Sumerian, like the early Sumerian civilization, that demonstrate that there were kings that were running society.
And over time, the Mesopotamians had a system where every year that they were at war, they had a war king and they had a peace king. And the thing is, when you're in permanent war, just the war king never leaves power. And the Native Americans, interestingly, had a similar system. And over time, the war kings installed themselves as emperors. And Mesopotamia was a system, Sumeria was a military dictatorship system where people would rise to power through brute force. Then someone else would kill.
All right, I think I've been going, or I've been reviewing this for almost 2 hours now, and we're only 29 minutes in, so I'm probably going to end it here. Obviously, the fact that I had to take 2 hours or so to review like 29 minutes of this video shows um, just how much just shows how much analysis I have to do, uh, and how much I, in general, just, regardless, the point is I take a really long time or I take a lot of time to review any videos that have anything to do with ancient history or topics that I am interested in. Um, so reviewing an entire 58-minute video, that would take me probably like 5 hours or something. So I'm gonna stop here at the 29-minute mark. Um, so yeah, let me know in the comments what you guys think of my reaction and my analysis or thoughts on this video. If you disagree or if you agree, yeah, just let me know in the comments what you think.